It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Michelle Lamont from Harvard, who will be sharing her book, Seeing Others. You've all seen the posters, so you know that Professor Lamont is a very accomplished person. But just to give you a sense of her influence on the discipline, I'm teaching sociology of culture right now. And yesterday we had our lecture where you sort of set up the whole sort of arc of that part of the discipline. And I spent most of 2 hours just sharing different articles that Michelle had written, to the point where I started worrying that the students thought I was being lazy and that I hadn't read anyone else's work. So that should give you a sense, I think. So the plan for today is Michelle will speak, and then our own Eric Fong will respond. And like I said, Michelle will be sharing Seeing Others, which I was incredibly excited about, since it's an opportunity for her work to reach outside of the ivory tower. And I think what's really special about Seeing Others is that it's a big conceptual advancement. What Michelle does in Seeing Others compared to her other work, she really tries to make her rich conceptual insights into something that's actionable, which is not usually something that as sociologists are comfortable doing. And so I think we need to do more of that. And I think the world needs more of that. So I'm incredibly excited to welcome Michelle Lamont to the University of Hong Kong.
Thank you so much for this introduction, Yona. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm very grateful to the department for hosting me, as well as my partner, Frank Dobbin, who will be giving talks next week. It's a real pleasure. We were here in 2016 visiting Chinese University for a short week, and it's great to be able to reconnect with friends here. And I'm particularly thrilled that Yona is here because I got to know her when she was a postdoc at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs during the pandemic. So we didn't see each other very often, but she is such a, full of energy and full of intellectual visions. And she had the real impact on the center. And I know that she's doing the same here. So I don't have that much time, so I'm going to jump directly in. It's a talk that I could easily take an hour to give, so I will try to do a lot of signaling. As Yona mentioned, this is a book that tries to go beyond academia. During the first Trump presidency, like many people, I was a little depressed, and I decided to look into the literature on where people find hope and how we find hope. And being a cultural sociologist, I was particularly interested in meaning making, how people interpret the world around them. What you learn when you read that literature is that exposure to narratives that allow you to imagine a different future is absolutely crucial in finding hope. So I kind of decided to write a book that would be precisely about that. Sociologists pride themselves on their critical power. We measure intelligence by our capacity to unveil the hidden, and that often means demonstrating what constrains people's action. But at the same time, we know that human social fabrics are created by a combination of constraints and agency. And this book is really about agency, which sometimes may look it a little bit Pollyannish, but I assure you it's not. The goal is really to try to ground empirically our understanding of where conceptions of social change come from through the perspective of cultural sociology. So of course, there's many ways of achieving this, but I draw on the analytical tools of my field of specialty to propose one agenda. And during the pandemic, I have two good friends at Harvard who had published a book on, titled How Democracy Dies. They're not close friends, but they're good colleagues. And it was really documenting the process by which democracy was under attack during the first Trump presidency. So I decided sociologists need to do the same thing, to try to give the lenses to the wide audience about what we're witnessing now. Trump, when he started, soon after he was elected, he did one very important executive order, which was unlike the many, many ones that he's doing now, which was about banning travel to Muslim countries. And then he had also some, new executive orders that were attacking trans people, same scenario more or less that we're seeing now. And to me, all of this was connected in the process of reinforcing the stigmatization of groups that were vulnerable. And, so therefore I decided to write a book precisely on this, on shared definitions of worth, how they become institutionalized, widely shared, and how we can further broaden the circle of people who feel that they're worthy and that they belong. And what you have here is two book covers, the American edition and the Penguin edition. The American edition, I like to show both side by side because they really illustrate what the book is about. The design of the American edition is very good because it shows the big circle illustrating this is, our shared definition of cultural membership, of who's worthy and who belongs. And you have groups of different size and different colors that are more or less central to this definition. In the other book, I don't like the design at all, but the title is perfect. And it's really what the book does, which is basically to offer a few strategies to understand better how to broaden the circle of people who feel they matters. So whereas a lot of philosophers or essayists or intellectual at large have tackled this question, and what distinguishes what I do is that I try to really have a systematic empirical approach to understand how this can be achieved, because after all, cultural sociology is an empirical field. So the context in which I wrote this book, I conceptualized it around 1918. We did the research in 1920. And that was during the pandemic. It was wonderful because everyone we wanted to interview was available. No one else had anything to do. And then, the book came out in 2023, so already almost 2 years ago. But the context was really one of explosions of many social movements that all were expressions of recognition claims. Groups that felt like they had been not treated with respect, groups that felt they had experienced deep injustices taking the street to claim recognition. So you had Black Lives Matter, you had Me Too. This was happening at both ends of the political spectrum. Supporters of Trump the MAGA movement was very much about claiming recognition too for the working class. So this claim for recognition, this claim for dignity is something that happens across the political spectrum. And I think that we really need to understand it much better and understand it in a way that is consistent at both ends of the political spectrum. This book in particular is about the progressive liberal end of the political spectrum. The talk that I'm going to give next week, which is about the work that I'm conducting right now, draws in part on interviews with young workers, 18 to 30, who live in New Hampshire, in Manchester, New Hampshire. And these young people are often non-voters, low information voters who are being seduced by MAGA. And we have a comparison between Manchester, New Hampshire and Manchester, UK, which I'm going to talk about. This new project I'm going to talk about next week is about different paths for seeking recognition in the global context. This path is mostly about the American case, but a lot of what I'm going to talk about is applicable to other contexts. And really, this book is more analytical, as you will see. It's more about setting a theoretical agenda. So the question again is who belongs, who matters, who is us? So in order to study this, I decided to focus on people whose job it is to create narratives about who we are. And this includes people like the person in the white t-shirt. This is a trans person whose name is Zachary Drucker, who served as an advisor on the show Transparent, which was on Netflix and was enormously successful, in part because it portrayed the life of a woman who becomes trans in the middle of, as she's an advanced middle-aged adult, and she has to renegotiate her relationship with her adult children. And when I interviewed the person who created that show, Joy Soloway, they told me that the show was created to make trans people less abhorrent, more understandable. by the wide audiences. To really move beyond the stereotype to depict them in three-dimensional ways. The words I just used are words that I heard time and time again during the course of the 185 interviews that we conducted with cultural producers who think of their job as really their role is to create new narratives, put them out there and scale them up so that little by little they chip away at the stereotypes and the stigmatization that certain groups experience. The other T-shirt, so you can see the white T-shirt, I see you. This is really about, what does it mean, I see you? It's about recognition. It's about acknowledging the value and the dignity of other people and understanding how they want to be perceived as authentically themselves instead of living in the closet. The black T-shirt is something that ended up on many people's lawns during the pandemic. And it's really about, or what I will call ordinary universalism, what all human beings have in common, this notion that no humans is illegal. That's a slogan that was publicized after the attack against undocumented immigrants. Love is a slogan that was central to the same-sex marriage campaign. So it's really about, again, broadening the circle of who matters. And the point of this is that the work of cultural diffusion that I'm going to talk about is really resulting in a trickle down of these narratives that ends up being adopted by a lot of the population. Now you're going to say, of course, Trump was just elected. What does it mean? What does it tell us about the success of this movement, which was so powerful and really tangible, especially during the summer of 2020, which gave us Black Lives Matter? Well, to put things in context, although Trump pretends that he's been elected by a landslide, he did not. He never had the majority of the votes. He won by 1.5% of votes. So really, we have to think about the fact that a very large proportion of the American population is still very much not on board with the vision of the society that is offering us. And a lot of what I'm going to talk to you about is this group that is now in complete disarray, not able to create a response or in a position that has any muscle to it, but nevertheless, it's part of the cultural currents of our society that remains very lively, as we will see, I'm sure, as soon as people regain their energy and are able to think more strategically. So the kind of people that were interviewed for this project include people like a woman named Channing Dunaway, who, when I interviewed her, was the vice president for Netflix, for the global diffusion, the global agenda. And she's the one who decided to diffuse worldwide Black Panther. Some people would certainly say, well, Netflix, we know Netflix, what they're about making money. Why would we think of Netflix as an agent of change? It is an agent of change to the extent that the diffusion of Black Panther worldwide had an enormous impact on young people in Africa and in India. The idea of having a depiction of a fictional world, people with, young people of color who were really heroes, was really a very important shift in perspective that, this person, Channing Dunaway, talked about as really the kind of work that she's motivated by as she's doing her job. So this is an example of something much broader. The inspiration for this project came from a 19-year-long collaboration I had with a team of multidisciplinary team of social scientists. We were called the Successful Society Program. We were funded by the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. And the goal was really to think about what are the conditions that lead to more successful societies, defined by things like, lower level of suicide, less intergroup conflicts. There's a number of indicators that sociologists may use or demographers may use as indicators of societal health. So this is the kind of thing we were concerned with. And our project in some ways was a response to the psychological literature on grit, which focuses on grit as a more or less a personality characteristic that allows people to pull themselves by their bootstrap, instead of focusing on this as an individual characteristic. We wanted to think about what are the characteristics of societies that are resilient, that have the capability of meeting the challenges that they face. And in order to understand how this worked, we focused on the role of institutions and cultural repertoires, by which I mean the cultural toolkits that are available to us in our environment, on which we can draw on to respond to the challenges that come our way. So an example of this would be the same-sex marriage law in the US, which when it was adopted by a number of states, you saw immediately a decline in an attempted suicide among LGBTQ youth in high school. So these laws, of course, were not passed to improve the mental health of teenagers, but an unintended consequence was to send them a message: you're worthy, you belong. And a lot of policies have implicit messages that really can contribute to the creation of this social resilience. So this is a book that came out in 2013, which really gave me more or less a framework about how to connect the micro, meso, and macro level. So here, the tools for resilience are operating at the meso level, but they have impact at the micro and macro level. So this is the theoretical framework. So the empirical basis is really these 185 interviews that we conducted with agents of change, people who are charged with producing, or whose job it is to produce narratives at the macro level. So it's the supply side, if you will, and that the messages are diffused society-wide and they have impact. We also look at cultural producers at the bottom level, bottom up, if you will, who we decided to focus on Gen Zs who were in college during the pandemic. We interviewed them before and during the pandemic to try to understand how they understand the challenges, how do they live the challenges that come their way, what kind of life do they want to have in the future, and how do they respond to these challenges. So a few definitions before I really get started. The main concept, there's a huge literature in philosophy and political and social theory on recognition. The key actors are philosophers, people like Axel Honneth and Nancy Fraser, who have engaged in a very famous debate around the politics of distribution and recognition, which all have to do with, should politics be about who gets what, or should it be about identity? And as people started talking about identity politics in the 90s, many old Marxists and many materialists and many economists said this thing about identity is just, wreaking havoc. We really need to focus on who gets what. What determines politics is who gets what. And the movement we've seen over the last 40 years is progressively people recognizing how central recognition is factored into the political choices that people are making. So now there's a big literature on affective polarization that is all about this, and sense of group identity, and how group identity is anchoring political choices with a focus on affective polarization, which is driving the success of the radical right party. I know that's a mouthful, but I'm just signaling here where I locate myself in this literature. Recognition for Axel Honneth is the social act by which positive social worth of individuals is affirmed. The counterpoint is stigmatization. Sociologists here are all familiar with Goffman. It's the counterpoint of recognition, the process that consists in qualifying negatively identities and differences. And these two are really an interaction with each other in how we define our social identity. Social identity is both how we define ourselves and how others define us. To give you a concrete example, I'm Quebecois. I'm a French Canadian. I know that resonates with some of you since there's a lot of Canadians teaching this department. And as I grew up during the 70s and the 80s, it was what we called in Canada the Quiet Revolution. And it was also a moment of collective transformation of the identity of French Canadians who had been historically stigmatized, concentrated at the bottom of the labor market. During the Quiet Revolution, there was a huge growth in the social economy, the development of the co-op movement. People used the state as a tool for collective empowerment and took back from English Canadian the controls of the economy, but it went hand in hand with an a big affirmation of the cultural dignity of Quebecois and an affirmation of our collective, cultural production. There was an explosion in all sectors of the art and culture, etc. The result was really a destigmatization. Now, if you look at surveys today as compared to 40 years ago, there's huge difference in how Quebecois are perceived. And those two movements together, recognition and the decline of stigmatization, go hand in hand. It's not only about how Quebecois came to define themselves, but it's also how outsiders came to define us. So self-identification, group categorization, articulate with one another to define what the social identity of a group is about. And this goes hand in hand with defining cultural membership. So whereas Hannette looked at this philosophically, I look at it as a cultural process through which cultural membership is defined. So the cultural process is something that we accomplish. It's some things that exist at the intersubjective level. I cannot define myself as having dignity. This is something that only others can do for me. So it's an intersubjective process. So that's a very important thing. And it happens as an unintended consequence or as part of the everyday interaction that we engage with each other. So it's very different than the nudging and the priming focus that is at the center of cognitive psychology. I could go into this in the Q&A if we have time. So all this to say, does it really matter? Some people will say what really matters is whether or not people have money. Well, we know from demography, we know from the literature on the allostatic load that how people experience dignity is really having huge impact on health, on material resources. I don't have time to get into this, but you'll have to believe me. If you don't believe me, you can read this new book, The Science of Dignity, which goes through the evidence demonstrating that essentially dignity is as important to well-being as material resources. And that's also a topic that we take on in this book, Getting Respect, which I co-authored and which came out in 2016, which looks at how Black people in three societies, US, Brazil, and Israel, experience racism and respond to it. And we also look at Palestinian citizens of Israel and Mizrahim Oriental Jews. So the broad intellectual agenda is really, and this is not part of the trade book, but this, I'm now talking to you as social scientists, is really to try to develop a systematic empirical sociology of recognition and to help us understand how stigmatized groups become destigmatized, and at the same time, how we can broaden cultural membership. So there's a number of scientific papers that are behind this trade book, and I'm just flashing them here in case you're interested. The first one is probably the most important, and I'm going to provide you 2-3 slides to show you what is the argument, essentially. Each of these papers are doing different things. So if we think about the literature on inequality, you have people like Doc Massey or Cecilia Ridgway who've tried to connect the cognitive with the macro structural changes. And a lot of what cultural sociologists have been doing, and this includes your colleague Gordon, they've been trying to connect, what's happening at the intracranial cognitive level with the meso and the macro level. So this is kind of the space in which I operate, and that this paper, What is Missing? Cultural Processes and the Making Inequality, tries to address. And what it does is basically, if you look at type 1 process, this is basically what you cover in any introduction to inequality class: opportunity hoarding, closure, domination. It's Marx, it's Weber, something that we've all been socialized into since our first class we took in sociology. The second kind of process is basically what Bourdieu talks about: symbolic boundaries, cultural capital, so ways in which inequality is produced that involves the mobilization of cultural scripts. And the third type is, like domination, exploitation processes. That's what Asian means, that it's unfolding, that it's ongoing, but it takes a lot of different forms, whether we look at identity, at stigma, at racialization, at recognition. So that's the space in which if you want to understand the literature in which I try to contribute in this work, this is where you have to look at it. And it takes place in a kind of multi-dimensional of understanding of how inequality is produced. So there's some aspects of this literature that's extremely mainstream. So under ecological effect, you have the work of my dear colleague, William Julius Wilson on neighborhood effects, or my colleague, Rob Sampson. But you have, we could add a lot of arrows here to show how sociologists understand the production of inequality, which is really multi-dimensional, and cultural sociology has a lot to contribute to this, although it's often not fully understood or included in how people think about the sociology of inequality. But it's changing quickly, I think. Okay, so now the findings. I'm going to try to take not more than 15-20 minutes, so we have time for Eric's comments and for a little bit of conversation. I'm going to go very quickly on the background because we all know this. Decades of growing inequality, the growing influence of the radical right, the crisis, the mental health crisis across many advanced industrial societies, the feeling that we live in a dead end. Millennials went on the job market after the 2008 crisis. Many of them could not buy houses. The American dream really was in deep crisis. So and the part of this that interests me most is the institutionalized scripts of self. This is what neo-institutionalism is all about, the work of John Mayer and others that tell us what kind of people we're supposed to be. And these scripts become really highly institutionalized and taken for granted. The most dominant script is the neoliberal script, which tell us first that we have to be self-reliant. So the notion of individualization of risk, and that we should be oriented toward upward mobility through education. People who don't have education are viewed as losers, that we should be engaged in the pursuit of status and education. And it's the dominant framework is one of competitiveness and Darwinism. Meritocracy is deeply associated with this because people who are professionals and managers who have a college degree are viewed as people who are meritorious because they have demonstrated the hard work and the persistence needed to achieve. So this is something that everyone in the room shares. At the same time, sociologists have repeated again and again that meritocracy in some ways is an illusion because we're not starting on an even playing field. My children have two parents who not only are Harvard professors, but who also both have PhDs. So our kids are born on an escalator. And that's true of probably many people in this room. So we celebrate meritocracy at the same time as we know that there's so many factors that end in the way that it's not truly a meritocracy. So the faith in meritocracy, independently of whether or not it is totally an empirical reality, has become overwhelmingly dominant in our society. So Jonathan Maisch published a wonderful paper where he documents the growing belief in the meritocracy from 1930 until today. And you can see on this very, very small word table that it has increased everywhere. In fact, this is just a few. You can see that in the United States, 95% of the population believes in meritocracy, and this has increased enormously since the 1970s. Same thing with the UK. So those are the two countries that are often described as the epitome of neoliberalism. And his conclusion is that it has increased in all but 5 of the 23 countries that he considered. The only countries where it has a decline is Austria, Canada, and France. So we can say that this script, this shared script, has become widely taken for granted. The problem with it is that in fact, it doesn't fully work. And many people know that because if you look at surveys, there's a lot of indication that the faith in the American dream has become much more fragile. Many people think that they will be able to achieve the American dream, but most people can't. At the same time, when you interview low-income people, including African Americans, everyone will profess to believe in it, in part because it's become a symbol of cultural membership, of the fact that you're truly American. at the same time, it's the American dream that brings in many immigrants to the US. So it remains at some level highly institutionalized. But it includes a deep internal contradiction, which is the fact that at the same time as the virtues of the upper middle class, this faith in the importance of socioeconomic success in education has become so widely shared, this script is really stigmatizing half of the population, people who are in the bottom half of the social ladder, the working class, low-income people, and even the lower middle class that has seen its experience of insecurity grow exponentially over the last 40 years as inequality increased. So I think it's a mode of thinking collectively about who's worthy that is deeply problematic, because for the working class, it's become extremely difficult to see any model affirming their worth. And this is clear when you look at the content of entertainment television, as did Richard Butch in this book, where he shows that through a very detailed content analysis, that of all the American television domestic situation comedy, it's very, very hard to see working class heroes. And when you find working class people who are represented in these shows, Bart Simpson, let's say, what you find is that they're represented as bumbling idiots. So it's really difficult for the working class to ever see themselves as valuable. And this has fed the phenomenon that has been widely described over the last few years. Think about the death by despair analysis by Anne Case and Angus Deaton. I don't need to get into details here, but many people have talked about this mental health crisis that is very, very profound among people below, but also very salient among people above, because in the upper middle class, there's been really an epidemic of mental health crises as well, because people are simply working too hard and they've become so obsessed with, the downward mobility of their children that they are really pushing their kids to excel at standardized tests. It's a problem here in Hong Kong and in the Chinese society. It's also a problem in the US, and kids learn that if they're not performing, they're not lovable. With the result that at Harvard, we have a very large number of students who are very important mental health problems. So we're experiencing this up close, since our work as faculty members has changed a lot as we're experiencing these crises. And I think the fact that we have one very hegemonic model of who is worthy that is captured by this notion of social success really feeds the crisis that we are encountering. Okay, all this is super depressing. Let's move on to something else. I'm going to drink some a little bit before going on. Are you all depressed enough? Does this resonate with anyone? Have you had students coming to your office super stressed out? Yes. Okay, so what are the solutions? There are many solutions. Of course, there are solutions that have to do with redistribution, but I'm going to focus on the cultural solutions. And I'm going to talk about 3 different ways to address the problem, which have to do with moving from a one-dimensional script of worth, having to do with socioeconomic success, to more pluralistic criteria of worth, so that more people can feel they're valuable, even if they don't follow in the pathways of Trump in trying to achieve socioeconomic success at any price. So second approach would be one focus on ordinary universalism, what we all share as human beings, and what we can focus on as a way to make everyone feel worthy. And the third element is to understand better how stigma reduction has happened in the past and how it can happen more. So the stigma reduction, I'll focus on the case of the declining stigma of people with HIV/AIDS, which is well understood. So here it's really an attack against the literature in social psychology that focuses on tribalism. Jonathan Haidt, for instance, who tell us that basically we are wired, they love to say that, to just love people like us and dislike people who are not part of our group. And instead of positing universality of human nature, which describes us basically as self-serving, instead I focus on the social processes that make that group boundaries can be changed, and they're being changed all the time. And this is something that we can exercise agency on, okay? So it's a very empowering message instead of focusing on this eternal human nature that, in fact, I think we know nothing about. It is all narrative about human nature. It's not about human nature. Okay, so how do we do this? We start with Habermas's notion of public sphere. So how can we study the public sphere? Of course, we're not in 19th century Vienna anymore. So we need to think beyond the coffee shop where the bourgeois man would get together to talk about the matters of the day, to think also in terms of the impact of social media and hybrid institutions. Here you have two articles that have tried to update how would we study empirically the public sphere today. We have in the room an expert on media studies who would tell us there's a lot of other articles to tackle this, but these are options. What we did for the project is we identified a number of organizational fields where narratives are being produced. So you have a few of them here. Here they're all the same size, but in fact, they're not the same size at all. And using this and networks and reaching very far field into all my networks and the networks of my friends, we reach out to people so we could put together this sample of 185 people who intervene in the public sphere. So if you buy the book, and if you even borrow it from the library, you're going to see our appendix has the list of people we interviewed, which I'm very, very proud about. So Steve Greenhouse was the labor journalist at the New York Times forever. You have really central people in a number of spheres. Some of them here, you have the social policy sphere. You have Heather Boucher, who was part of Biden's Council of Economic Advisor. You have leaders in the climate justice movement. So for instance, Bill McKibben. If you were American, you would recognize a lot of these names. You don't have to, of course. Some of the names some sociologists would recognize is Kimberly Crenshaw, who's associated with the concept of intersectionality. And we have 75 interviews conducted with Hollywood creatives, Queer Eye, Michael Schur, who created Park and Recreation, list of very, very influential people. Jack Conte, who created Patreon. So we reached out to them and asked them questions about what do you do with your work. So first, a very idiosyncratic, or some could think idiosyncratic example, Black artists who think of their work as basically trying to give voice to groups that are under-recognized or who are stereotyped. So Lyle Ashton Harris's work is basically photography about the trans community. And when I ask him what he does, the words that he uses here try to give three-dimensional depiction of who they are, to humanize them, to dignify them, represent them the way they would want to be seen themselves. So this is really what the work of destigmatization is about. And the 75 interviews we did with stand-up comics and Hollywood creative, we created the typology of the ways in which they say that they engage in recognition. And this typology is, that paper is coming out now in Work and Occupation. Just to give you one example, the Trojan horse strategy is the stand-up comic who say, my job is not to force my audience to eat their vegetables. I'm going to tell funny stories. And while I tell these stories, I'm going to send messages about, what is abhorrent in our political system and what kind of change we should try to promote. So the goal is to make visible groups that are invisible, to broaden how we understand them, etc. So they really think of their work as very centrally concerned with this. Very few of those 75 people we interviewed oppose this kind of way of doing humor. And these people denounce it as, well, how do they call it? I don't remember, but they think these are older men whose humor typically was about sex, and they thought that was not political in any way, but it was totally political too. They didn't know. Okay, so a more mainstream example is this video that you can find on YouTube. If you type question bridge, you will see this video, which gives a voice of 150 Black men from around the US. And the person who created it, Hank Willis Thomas, asked them, what does it mean to you to be a Black man today? And what he found is that they have nothing in common except for the experience of being constantly exposed to microaggression in their daily life. What's interesting with this video is that Hank Willis Thomas created an association with an organization called the Campaign for Black Male Achievement, which has been associated with the My Brother's Keeper, which Obama embraced. And they used this video to diffuse it across a lot of high schools and community centers across the US to create discussions around this stigma of the Black man. And when I interviewed Sean Dove, the director of this philanthropic organization, he said, we're in the business of transforming narratives, of getting people to understand Black men not as a source of poverty and crime, but as a source of aspiration and capabilities and community building. So it's really, the challenge was really to transform the frames and to scale them up. So the book comes up with this notion of recognition chains, which is really about the collaboration between cultural producers who put out there in our cultural ecosystem representations about, really that aim to destigmatize groups that have been historically stigmatized. And then they create collaborations with funders who are providing a lot of money to scale up these messages, to really transform the cultural repertoires that are most readily available to us as we lead our life. So this is what makes the project focus on cultural structures, the systematic transformation of the cultural structures in which we live. And this is not just a happenstance. The philanthropic field has been deeply transformed by this focus on narratives. And that is the work. One of the organizations that was leading this change is the Ford Foundation, which has been headed by a guy named Darren Walker, who is himself a Black gay man. And he said from the beginning, when he took on the leadership of the Ford Foundation, which is one of the largest foundations in the world, he said, my goal will be to attack inequality. And I'm going to do this through 4 pillars. Of course, distributing resources, but one of the pillars will be capturing hearts and minds, by which I mean transforming narratives. So this is a very purposeful strategy to achieve this, and recognizing the centrality of narratives in the reproduction of inequality, and which means giving money not only to economists, but to a lot of other people, including film producers. So one of the projects that Ford was behind is the film Roma, which depicts the life of 2 indigenous domestic workers who work in Mexico City. And when you watch this film, which won an Oscar, which was diffused on Netflix, and which was celebrated in the great many ways, the middle-class family for whom those domestic workers are working are always blurred in the background. And the camera is centered on the face of these women. And one of them is she's deliberating about whether or not she wants to have an abortion. So what the film does is really humanize her and describe her in a 3-dimensional way. And the film was produced with the collaboration of the Domestic Alliance for the National Alliance for Domestic Workers, headed by Agent Pooh, who is a big leader in labor in the US, and she played a very important role in unionizing domestic workers and increasing their salaries. And I was able to interview her for the book as well. So that's an example of, if you will, a very systematic attempt at transforming one stigma, the stigma of domestic workers. But the Gates Foundation did the same thing in trying to shift frames about explanations of poverty in the US, going from blaming the victim, culturalist explanation, to more structural explanation. So it's happened at many, many levels through these collaborations between the philanthropic organizations and cultural producers. So that's one level. And the result is really to provide, little by little, a much more pluralistic understanding of who's worthy. Okay, if you read the book, you'll see there's much more, but that's all I can say about this for now. Second approach is really to understand how groups that have been deeply stigmatized in the past have become destigmatized. So this happened with people with AIDS. When I moved to the US in 1983, I went to Stanford as a postdoc. It was the beginning of the AIDS crisis. Everyone was very scared of people who had AIDS. It was a little bit like the beginning of COVID, like people were afraid of touching people with AIDS, but little by little, this stigma was challenged. And in our paper, we draw on the secondary literature on this topic, for instance, the work of Steve Epstein, to recognize how this process of reducing the stigma of people with HIV/AIDS happened. And we compare it to the case of obesity, which has remained deeply stigmatized. Here we draw on the book of Abigail Sagi, What's Wrong with Fat, which tells the same story. And basically the key actors are social movement participants, of course, but the key actors are people like us, knowledge workers, not only social scientists, but also journalists, legal expert, medical expert, who provided evidence that anyone can get AIDS, whereas originally it was depicted by journalists as the disease of gay men who were spending too much time in public bathrooms having sex with random people. Medical expert told us actually anyone can have AIDS. So the moral stigma of it disappeared little by little. And then you had Magic Johnson, big African-American athlete who stood up publicly and said, I have AIDS. And then you had Lady Di who came to the US and was photographed removing her gloves and shaking the hands of people with AIDS. So there was also key, iconic figures that engage in destigmatizing action. So the bigger story is really that these group boundaries exist, but can be challenged, and boundaries can become much more fluid and permeable. And that's a collective achievement. So that's why it's a book about hope, because it gives us information about how on a daily basis, all these micro actions can add up and transform the boundaries in which that characterize the society we live in. And finally, briefly, I'll talk about the chapter on Gen Zs. So when we interviewed them, they were, of course, very critical of boomers. So I couldn't do these interviews myself. I had two graduate students who were Gen Zs themselves who interviewed them. They felt like, okay, move over, boomers, you really screwed up with climate change. Now it's our turn. We're in the cockpit now. So these two wonderful graduate students I was working with did these 80 interviews, and we came up with a couple of papers that describe the world that the Gen Zs live in. And what we found is, of course, they're American kids. So they believe that it's really important to take your life in your hand and be agentic. So they really, in part, embrace the American dream and the focus on work that is so central to Americans. But they also don't fully, not at all, embrace the idea that our goal should be the white picket fence, buy your house, become a big consumer, because they think this is damaging to the environment, but also they think it's not a scenario that is at their disposal. And I gather in China, you have something similar with the lying down generation, right? With the idea that the Chinese dream is also not a reality anymore. And one thing they do that was not at all characteristic of my generation is that they think they have something called mental health. So they embrace the therapeutic ethos and they want to have a work-life balance. So that was absolutely central, and they really reining the desire of upward mobility with an equally powerful desire to have a life that they think is healthy and allows them to go on the long term. And this together combined allows them to aspire to what they call ordinary universalism, the ability for people to relate truly with others and to be authentically themselves, and being happy in the now by being able to develop meaningful relationship on a daily basis is really crucial to them. So what we saw in these interviews conducted in 2020 is that they really were coming up with a very different scripts of self that was in many ways at odds with the caricature of the American dream that I talked about recently. Now we could talk about differences between male and female and how they voted, but in the recent election, but I don't have much time for this. And we also have another paper that talks about class differences between the privileged and the less privileged students, with the working class students being much less likely to want to think of themselves as centrally involved in this, because during the pandemic, they were busy helping their parents pay their bills, essentially, as opposed to seeing themselves as leaders of social change. So where did this leave us? Well, I talked very rapidly about several strategies for broadening inclusion. There are more, for instance, mobilizing policymakers. But at the end of the day, all these changes are trickling down and they contribute to what we could see as a transformation of how most people are thinking about what brings us together in a society and what makes that we can coexist. And a lot of the changes that we've seen have to do with the celebration of ordinary universalism, which is captured by this poster, which was also on many lawns during the pandemic. So the book makes, I was the co-leader of this report, of the Human Development Report, which is produced every year by the UN and distributed worldwide, and is used by many countries to define their projects. But what's this different between this report and the other one is that it's all about narrative and social movement. And it brings the agenda of sociology to policymakers. So that was my own little act of public sociology to try to contribute to social change. And the last takeaway is that this empathy is very important, of course, but the takeaway from this book is not that it's only about empathy. It's very much about the systematic transformation of the cultural repertoires in which we live. And that's where, you know, gaining a better understanding of how group boundaries can be changed is really important. And I think that's the contribution of cultural sociology to a sociology of hope that is not Pollyannish, but that can maybe have real impact. So I'll stop here. I'll thank the funders and the students who have, the research assistant who have contributed to the project. And I thank you for your attention and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for delivering such a intellectually stimulating lecture. I guess the topic is really timely because every one of us realize that we are in a very divided world. And I think Michelle provided a very insightful entry point for us to understand about this division. And she suggested about the issues of the recognition and also suggested how we should deal with the issues of recognition. And I can see that there's a lot of policy implications there. And also I can see that there are a lot of potentials research, and as myself, you know, as a empirical sociologist at training, I'm a social demographer, and I can also see that there's a lot of potential empirical work to test what you suggest. So I think I'm sure that down the road the work will getting more and more important. But then for this very short time, I don't want to talk so much about the work on recognition. I rather to talk about another piece of work that Michelle has contributed. I think several decades ago, I would say that now is the work that when she published the work of The Dignity of Working Man. I hope everyone have a chance to take a look at this book. It's a really fascinating book. The reason is because she, in the book, she introduced the work of the group boundary, and later the work she further elaborate in other work. Before I came to this lecture, I visited the website and look at the work that she published with on the annual review of sociology on the group boundary. Only one piece is a theoretical piece, and it received about more than 4,000 citations. So you can see that the inference is substantial. And because usually when you have a theoretical piece, you may get only 100 or the most is 200 citations, but this piece got 4,000, more than 4,000 citations. So definitely is affect not only sociologists, but also also I guess is social sciences in general. But because I'm more familiar of immigration literature, so I would like to highlight a little bit how the group boundary, the concept, shaped the development of the discussion of immigration literature. Some of you may be familiar with the immigration literature when Robert Park first suggests about the concept of assimilation to understand about how immigrant experience in the New World. Later on, of course, this concept of assimilation becomes the dominant idea of understanding about immigrant adaptation. So later on, like for example, Milton Gordon in his work of the assimilation in the American life defined about 6 dimensions of assimilation. And over the years, over the decades, a lot of people trying to modify the concept of assimilation, but basically it's about like going up or going down or being stuck somewhere. So that is the way they think about assimilation. But then because of the concept of group boundaries, a group of researchers, I guess, starting in the 1980s, borrowed the idea of group boundaries, started to incorporate in understanding of immigration adaptation. So they are saying that when we think about assimilation, it's not about going up or down or stuck there, but rather is the way to include or cross the boundary and integrate into the the local community or the local group. So the way that it's really transformed us to understand about assimilation is that instead of really thinking about how to going up or down, but rather is to cross the boundary. And I think it provides a concept or conceptual tool for us to understand a new way to understand about the immigrant adaptation. And I think that is a very, very important, I would say, important step, moving one step further for us to understand about immigrant adaptation. Give you an example that how the concept applying the concept of group boundary to understand immigration adaptation, why it is so important in immigration literature. So I guess some of you may be familiar with the work by Wimmer in Columbia, published a piece of work in American Journal of Sociology about the group boundary and further elaborate the idea of group boundary. And later on, two colleagues, Richard Alber and Victor Lee, published a very important piece, remaking of the American Dream. The book got an award by the award in the immigration session, the American Sociological Session. One of the major contributions is that, of course, they contribute the idea of using institutional approach to understanding assimilation. But in the book, they also have a long session to incorporate the idea of boundary, how boundary can help us to understand about immigration adaptation. Of course, later, Doug Massey even used one of his books using the title of Brookered Boundary to describe about the Mexican integration in the American society. So you can see that the work group boundary actually make an important contribution in the field of immigration. And I'm sure that the concept also can contribute to understand different social phenomenon, social patterns, and also social structures. One thing I find that is fascinating about the group boundary, the concept itself, is because the way we think about group in the past is always about how to define the group members, how do we define the groups. But the group boundary, the concept itself is very smart in a sense that we don't define who are in the group and what is a group, but rather than to use the boundary to define who we are and who we are not. And I think this kind of idea reflect in Michelle just of the presentation about the recognition. So I think I'm going to stop here. I'm sure that many of you will have a lot of questions and also would like to discuss with Michelle. So now we open the floor to the discussion. So there are 2 hands raised at the back.
Thank you, Professor. Actually, I'm not from Faculty of Social Science, but I'm from Urban Planning Department and also very interested in these culture concepts. And I have a small question for you. You mentioned that the roles of agencies and institutions are very important in these cultural processes. But the thing is, we are facing a world with more and more segmented informations. Like even all of us are sitting in the same classroom and listening to the same class, but we don't even know what other people's phones, their social medias are giving the information to them. We don't even know about each other. And so my question is, what's your opinion about the role of agencies or institutions when some of the people, they just keep asleep and taking on the sleeping pills that social medias give to them, and to make the whole the process that you mentioned to not just a very small party that limited in like between us. That's all. Thank you.
Yes, great question. Thank you so much. I think what we need is really to understand, to have much more information about how exposure to social media is really leading to segmentation. We know that this is heavily age graded, and we know that today, at least in the United States, the 6 o'clock news on television is still how most Americans are consuming their news. So there's a huge problem with doing what sociologists call sampling on the dependent variable. They look at the young population that is addicted to social media and generalize to the population at large. So I think, in fact, if we have a much more parsimonious approach to understanding where people get their information and what they do with this information, we would not have as catastrophic an analysis. And also a lot of people, we see it with our interviews with workers in Manchester. There's a lot of skepticism also in terms of what people are consuming. So it calls for a much more measured understanding of, the field of communication studies is largely dominated by psychologists who are talking about concepts such as resonance. So I think there's a huge opportunity to connect the dots by bringing together cultural sociology, communication studies, media studies, and social psychology to understand at a much more, practice focus, what are the various segments of the society doing with the information that they consume, and what does it mean in terms of togetherness. So.
Okay, so here and there.
Hi, Michelle. I have just a small conceptual or analytical question, which is you talked about recognition and worth and dignity, and I'm wondering if those are synonyms or if they mean something different. And then how do they or recognition differ from the old tried and true sociological concept of status?
That's great. Well, the literature on status has tended to emphasize socioeconomic status. In the more recent work, the work of Cecilia Ridgway, for instance, she doesn't do this, but a lot of her assumptions are basically about how individuals in small groups are defined as high status. And the criteria may be like competence of conformity to groups, group objectives, and that really is because of where she comes from theoretically. The status expectation paradigm she was part of is really framing her approach to status, and that's very different than the very inductively based approach I have to worth. My approach to these questions from the very beginning, I have a paper with Annette Leroux that came out in '87, where we criticized Bourdieu's approach for presuming that familiarity with high culture was the form of worth most valued by the upper middle class. And my first book, Money, Morals, and Manners, was very much oriented toward showing that moral worth is actually the key driver for boundary work in the upper middle class. And then my second book, in the working class as well. So my approach to this is that it has to be extremely bottom up. The way people use the term dignity tends to be very much anchored in a humanistic framework of, recognizing the dignity of all human beings, like in the eyes of gods. Even the term respect tends to have a focus on the interpersonal. So I use the term recognition as an umbrella term, and I'm not too focused on these conceptual nuances, but I think it's like in Wittgenstein's framework, a family of concepts that are tapping things that all have to do with the templates through which we assess people's value.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So the topic is about the agency. This is indeed a very important topic, and also I'm very interested in it. And your research at the macro level of society. Then you interviewed many famous people. They are very influential, especially those cultural producers. So I'm interested in this part. So it seems all interviews in your study are very powerful or privileged.
Yes.
And even the social actors you mentioned, they are knowledge workers. So I'm curious about how will you reflect on the power in this process of narrative transformation? Or put the question in another way is, how will you reflect on how do ordinary people can initiate, how can they initiate narrative transformation?
Yeah, you're right. Thank you so much. You're right to point out this focus of the book. This book comes after the 2016 book where we interviewed ordinary people. So in my mind, it's very much part in the Dignity of Working Man to we're focused on ordinary people. So in some ways, these books are in conversation with each other. And in the next project, which is on pathways to recognition, we interview not only young workers in Manchester, New Hampshire, Manchester, UK, but also Indigenous people in Canada, 2 hours north of where I grew up, and in the Micronesia. So it's really, we're returning to the focus on ordinary people. So for me, it's more like you have different work tables and you're moving between the work tables to try to understand a phenomenon more comprehensively as you move forward. So it's not either or, basically.
So the first question is about how you reflect on power.
Yeah, so, like the basic definition is power is the capacity to force people to do things they wouldn't do otherwise. So that's a very direct approach to power. But with, Stephen Luke's radical theory of power and others, we've moved toward power as agenda setting. So a lot of what's happening with the people we interviewed for this project is that's what they're trying to do. To provide a definition of reality that we can share because it's diffused at a very macro level, which was subtly enabled and constrains different ways of being. So if I were to write a paper that was a complement to this book, this is very much how I would frame this. My very first article was titled The Power Culture Link. And I would recur to that because this is really what's influencing what I'm talking to you now. Very influenced by Stephen Luke's classical paper on the third dimension of his book on the third dimension of power.
There's one at the back, and then up, and then you.
Sure. I think my question is in context of Hong Kong, like how do you as a French Canadian and also a sociologist, how would you, that through your observation, how would you mediate the pursuit of I guess recognition in the context of Hong Kong, for example? Like I'm a new immigrant here, like for 2 years. I feel like this place can't. You ask us, are you anxious, desperate? I think many of us probably are. This is a place that's pursuing of status, wealth, and consumption to the extreme level, just like New York City. I mean, what would your I guess you have to say about this in this community?
Well, you want me to talk about things I don't know since I've been here for a week, so I would have to resort to stereotypes. But you said it all, and I think on the other hand, I have a Chinese graduate student who wrote a paper on the lying down generation, where she takes up these very questions. My sense is there's a lot of similarity between what's happening with young people in China right now, given the economic crisis and the limited prospect of upward mobility. And I think often people of that generation are, the Gen Z description I had, which is like they try to create a zone of cultural autonomy where they can have a decent life, where their conception of self doesn't have to be fully connected with, the dominant messages that they are receiving about what their life should look like. And that's very much what we see in the in my milieu, if you will. But the kids, the young people are certainly struggling. And the parents too, because the parents are super anxious about what children are doing. And I speak with knowledge about this.
Thank you, Professor. I really enjoyed. I was actually coincided with my this morning reading. I couldn't sleep last night. I was reading the book called The Tyranny of the Merit, by Michael J. Sandel.
Yeah.
It's,
My colleague.
It's a coincided. We were talking about it before we come up to the lecture room. And my question is about the vocabulary, which is quite dominant in different society. I'm just talking about, for example, Hong Kong. We have this vocabulary well established and dominant. When our children go to education system and learn about these terminologies or vocabularies, for example, in Hong Kong, we have such a thing called minority majority, or we call it ethnic minority and the majority. And then you have societies like America, black or white, or we have immigrant and non-immigrant. My question is there any studies done whether these vocabularies need to be revisited? Because from the childhood, we are actually trying to categorize people. So what you want to eliminate when they're in the, let's say, a generation who already wasted, they're already a victim of discrimination for so many years. That's my question.
Well, there's a lot of debates around these categories. Just to give you the example of my graduate student who's studying the transformation of what she calls meta category in the US and the UK, where in the US we moved away from the category minority to people of color. And then there was a debate among people of color. BIPOC was Black, Indigenous, and people of color. African Americans felt like, no, we don't want to be put in this bag because our suffering is much greater and we're not immigrants. We have, we've been forced to come here. So this can be studied sociologically, by really tracing, and in the UK, you have the BAM category, Black, Asian, and Middle Eastern, which serves the same purpose. So she's studying the phenomenon of institutionalization of these categories in census categories, but the role of cultural producers, a little bit the way I do in my book, in the institutionalization of these categories. So as sociologists, we're not psychologists, Some people are looking at how people are experiencing these categories at the individual level. We're better equipped to look at how they institutionalize. It is really the work of, immigrant experts in part, the whole question of the interaction between civil society and census categories is a whole field of study. So, but categorization is inherent to human life, it's not going to go away, but we want to have the categories that are least alienating. So I know that in the Netherlands, I just spent 5 months in the Netherlands, they moved away from the category allophone. Like allophone, they met middle, Moroccans essentially. In Canada, we like the category allophone. At least we did when I lived there. I don't know if it has been, rejected, but, the society is organized between Francophone, Anglophone, and allophones. And I think it's accepted, right? It's not prescribed the way that it is in the Netherlands. So each national context has its own debate around these.
Okay, so we still, okay. Michael.
Hi, thank you so much. So much of cultural sociology and public sociology began with this mission to address states that were growing in their power and out of control markets. And that's why Trump puts in executive orders to halt all DEI related research. And I was curious about the meta recognition of sociology, the resilience of social sciences in general.
Yeah, well, the discipline, what happened over the last 20, 25 years, I think, is that economics and psychology have become extremely predominant in the public sphere in diffusing frameworks like grit or nudging that have become, everyone is using it. The expression, we're wired to do X, has now become part of common sense. But sociology, there's a wonderful paper, Tim Hallett et al., ASR 2023, I think, which looks at the diffusion of Bowling Alone, Clash of Civilization, Second Shift, books in sociology that have been widely used in the media. So we've had, there's again something that has been studied empirically, and I think sociologists in some ways, we're not in a phase where we're the favored discipline. On the other hand, I think there's a lot of sociologists who are deeply committed to the importance of what we're doing, and we're doing the work, and it's going to continue, it's not going to go away. And I think the work is absolutely essential. So while we're not getting the limelight and we're not the Danny Kahneman of this world, I think it's very important that we continue to do what we're doing, because the framework we offer are very, very different and are based on very different assumptions at these disciplines. So I think it's important.
Yeah, thanks so much, Michelle. Wonderful talk. I have a question about the agents of change. Because, for example, in the case of Hong Kong, many agents of change had to leave the past 5 years
Yes.
to other places. In my country, the Netherlands, agents of change have also increasingly difficult in the States as well. So should one not take that political context still as more prominent in the work then, that actually the context in which agents of change operate often silences?
Yes.
And they are being replaced increasingly by, say, Jordan Peterson or Elon Musk as important agents of change as well. So how to deal with
Absolutely. So one of the weaknesses of the project is that I'm only looking at the liberal progressive end of the political spectrum. I mean, ideally, I would write another book, which would be on the Jordan Peterson of this world, but I'm not, because I didn't do it in the first book, in part because I felt there was a number of books that were really looking at this very systematically. And the literature on social movement tell us there's always movement and counter movement. So that's absolutely unavoidable. So we know that since Trump came to power, there's a lot of pushback. There's a lot of people that are saying things openly, homophobia, expression of homophobia that is becoming way more, explicit and out there. So this tug of war, I think, is crucial, and other people will have to study it. I'm not, as you know, unlike you, I'm not a media expert. So I think like people who do this will need to really know what they're doing. I look forward to talking to you about this.
Okay, maybe the last question at the end. Can you speak?
Thank you, Professor. I actually have 2 questions. The first one is actually a little bit similar to what has been mentioned before. I really like your idea of how seeing others can cure a divided world. It reminds me of like decades ago, the Palestinians. Some of them can actually go to Israel and work there so that the people can actually see each other. My question is, how can the division of the people who can actually see each other and the people who cannot see each other be like, how can that division be bridged? And the second question is about the assimilation that was just mentioned, because I'm a little bit confused, because it reminds me of the French idea, French cultural policy of assimilation in terms of immigrants. I'm not actually really sure about what it's like in the American terms, maybe. I look forward to your answers.
Okay, thank you so much. I mean, sociologists have written a lot on contact theory, the idea that intergroup contact is really central to, growing social integration. But there's also literatures that tell us actually the more in context of scarcity, more contact may lead to more competition. So it's very complicated. As Eric was saying, this literature on assimilation has changed a lot. It's being replaced by different concepts like incorporation instead of assimilation. There's been much more of a focus now on, I think, bringing in, like you were totally right to point to the conversation between demographers and sociologists, because what is happening now is there's much more concern with connecting the patterns of spatial and social segregation having to do with distribution of resources, networks, who marries whom, to connecting them with symbolic boundaries and the patterns of moral boundaries being drawn. So my response to you is kind of the response of the scholar. Yes, we're making progress in understanding how this works, and the question of how it's going to be influencing how people interact with each other in the world is to be determined. But
okay. Thank you so much. I just would like to mention one thing that Michelle will be in with us for about 3 weeks, and her office is on the 9th floor in sociology department. So if you have any questions or you have any things you would like to discuss with her, you can feel free to stop by. I'm sure that she will be happy to discuss with you. So once again, let us join together to thank Michelle to share with us her recent work. Thank you so much.
Thank